Okay, very good afternoon from the UK, from Oxford. Um, it's September, and so we're restarting our Centre for Global Higher Education webinar series, and it's lovely to be welcoming so many of you here for the first of the autumn webinars. And Oxford is the trees are beginning to turn, and the apples are certainly ripening, but it's a great chance to think about the start of the academic year, and it's a real pleasure to be inviting Ben Mulvey, who's a lecturer at the University of Glasgow, to be talking about his book. And I'm just going to show you a couple of slides just to remind you, in case you needed a reminder, that this is going to be recorded. As always, our webinars are available on our website the next day, and the transcripts and slides will be as well. We've also just our normal procedure. We suggest you stay muted, and then turn your video on when you want to ask a question at the end. You can look at the speaker through the speaker view, and I'll invite you to ask questions after Ben's talk for half an hour. Ben, I think that's probably enough from me, and I will just click that to end there, and I will let Ben share his screen and get going. Welcome, Ben.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Just give me a second to find slides. Sorry, just give me a second.
Problem.
I've accidentally closed my presentation. Okay, yeah. So can everybody see that?
That's perfect. Screen's
Yeah,
yours.
brilliant. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. And yeah, thanks to David and the Centre for Global Higher Education for the invitation. And thanks to you all as well for making the time to kind of come and listen to this quite brief introduction to the research that I've been doing over the past few years. Yeah, so my name is Ben Mulvey. I'm a lecturer at the University of Glasgow, and before this I was a postdoc. I did my PhD at the Education University of Hong Kong. So it's really great to have this opportunity to introduce this book. It's a culmination of kind of several years' work. It's based on the research that I did for my PhD. There were lots of kind of challenges associated with that. Obviously, being in Hong Kong between 2018 and 2021, the pandemic, and lots of moving around in between that. So it's great to finally, for this book to finally be out there, and yeah, to have the opportunity to kind of present this to you. So, I mean, a very brief summary of the book, and then I'm gonna kind of, I was deciding whether to kind of just present a portion of it or present the entire thing. So I've gone for like a brief summary of the entire book, and just to go through each of the chapters and what the contribution is. So I mean, broadly speaking, yeah, so patterns of migration are changing globally. And we know kind of so little about China as a migration destination in general. And yeah, and obviously there's the broader kind of geopolitical importance of this particular student flow, and potential implications that it has down the line for kind of social, political, economic change across the African continent, which that's not really the focus of this book, but it's something that everybody seems to be interested in for obvious reasons. So it's something that I'll kind of reflect on briefly at the end. So in the book, I don't go into a huge amount of detail on the methodology actually, but it's just a series of interviews, so 45 interviews, and so with current students and recent graduates, and yeah, focuses on kind of part of it is a structural. I look at how the these global kind of structures and modalities of integration into global economy shape the migration trajectories, experiences, outcomes of this group of students. And my kind of claim is that this looking into this flow of students challenges, many of our assumptions about internationally mobile students and the nature of international student mobility. And yeah, I also wanted to kind of reflect on the fact that I focused on Africa as well. There's a brief section in the book on this. I think that's kind of something that's, it kind of seems strange to some people because it's like obviously Africa is a continent. It's not a country. It's extremely diverse. But I think, what I was essentially doing was looking at this the way that it's often kind of framed by the Chinese government, and also in most of the other academic work on this topic. So it's taking a broad kind of whole of the continent focus. So, yeah, I mean, a very brief bit of historical context. So this isn't a recent kind of development. So on and off, there's been flows of students from Africa to China, including in the kind of pre-reform in the just before the Cultural Revolution. So 95 African students were given scholarships to study in China in 1960. There's a really interesting book about this. So an African student in China by Emmanuel John Heavy. So it's really interesting if you can kind of get your hands on it. Obviously, there was very, very few foreigners in China at that time. But there's some interesting parallels with the present day, which is why I wanted to frame it by starting off with this kind of the first book ever written about student mobility between Africa and China. So obviously the quote there kind of, it just is there to emphasize that, like today, there's a very strong kind of geopolitical rationale of for student mobility. And at that time, it was kind of exporting revolution. So that's kind of slightly changed, but the rationale is still political. And then a lot of the challenges that students faced, despite that being, kind of half a century ago, there's lots of parallels. So Heavy's is really, really critical of his experience, and eventually most of that cohort left in protest at the maltreatment of African students in China. So there's lots of parallels with today and some differences as well. So I think that's a good way to frame the rest of this presentation. So yeah, I mean, basically to explain why are so many students or young people from Africa going to China to study. Obviously, it's related to kind of the shifts that are taking place in the global political economy, the increasing presence of Africa in China. So of China in Africa, sorry. So China's the largest trading partner for the continent as a whole, if that makes sense. So the largest source of foreign direct investment for the continent as a whole, and the largest foreign job creator. So that's Chinese companies, create something like 50, 60,000 jobs or have created. So a huge kind of impact on Africa, and obviously that's what really drives the mobility between the two places. So China's kind of political gambit in Africa and its economic engagement, which kind of motivates students to go to China to study. And I'll get into more detail on that later. And then, yeah, there's some kind of characteristics of Chinese engagement with Africa that are slightly different to for example, Western engagement, so a focus on foreign direct investment and trade and development finance over development aid. And something that I talk about a lot in the book is this spatial fix. And it's really important to see student mobility as part of a strategy to enable that. So yeah, so most countries in Africa are kind of entwined with China as part of this spatial fix, or you could kind of describe it as a geographical reconfiguration of the Chinese economy as a response to a problem of kind of capital overaccumulation. So the Chinese state is compelled to reconfigure Chinese capitalism over a much larger spatial dimension in order to sustain capital accumulation. So if you think about the Belt and Road, for example, there's that increasing connectivity and improved trade and financial integration facilitates the profit maximization for Chinese state and non-state actors. Student mobility, part of that. So creating a cadre of elites that will enable China to achieve those kinds of goals. And yeah, just very brief to show you how China's foreign direct investment to Africa has increased over time relative to the US. Yeah, so Africans now represent the second largest regional grouping in China, after obviously students from China's kind of direct peripheries, Southeast Asia and South Korea, places like that. And I have to say that these statistics are slightly out of date, but that's because these are the most up-to-date ones that we have. So since the pandemic, there hasn't been any. Usually there's yearly statistics released on student numbers in China, and they've stopped doing that. So this is kind of as of before the pandemic. It's really, really difficult to say whether this has changed, because this is becoming kind of less and less transparent, and it's more difficult to know what the student numbers are. So there's nearly 60,000 in China on degree-bearing courses, and more than that if you include students on language courses. Obviously, it's underpinned by a strong kind of para-diplomat rationale. So the idea that these students are future elites that will go on to kind of present a favorable image of China in the home country and have some influence on policy making that will be favorable to the Chinese government. And then in terms of the largest source countries, one thing that people often kind of ask me is there an association between, for example, the number of scholarships that are given and how good the bilateral relationship is between the host country and the source country. That's really difficult to say. So the largest source countries are Nigeria, Ghana, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe. So obviously, if we think about particularly Tanzania, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, they are all kind of strategic allies of China in Africa. So, I mean, it's probably kind of, and at the same time, obviously, Nigeria is a large population, so that's probably part of the reason why more scholarships for them, and more students going to China and relatively wealthy as well. So it's probably a mix of kind of how the bilateral relations are and the kind of wealthiness and the size of the country. Yeah, so about scholarships. So approximately 12,500 were given to students, African students in 2018, again, the most recent year that we have statistics for. But what we don't know is whether that level of provision will continue in the future. So that's a huge number of scholarships per year. So the number of scholarships that are pledged is massive, and it's far more than any other destination country offers. So that kind of explains why there's this level of student mobility between countries in Africa to China. But at the most recent Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, there was no usually a specific number is given or pledged at each FOCAC meeting. And in the most recent one, there was no specific number. So, I mean, does that suggest kind of a retrenchment from Africa? Is it something to do with the Chinese economy not being as strong? We don't really know, and we don't really know what's happening in China with regard to student numbers at the moment. We know that, for example, for students from the US, students from South Korea, the numbers have gone down, but we don't have the bigger picture, particularly with regard to African students. And yeah, so obviously that number of students, they're not restricted to any particular subject area, but obviously they tend to be more in science, technology, engineering, management, and Chinese language. So, I mean, very briefly, how are these students depicted in the policy texts and the finding or the key kind of takeaway is that there's two contradictory messages. So anyone familiar with China's foreign aid or its engagement with other countries or the Belt and Road will be aware of this kind of rhetoric or this kind of slogan politics. So there's lots of slogans like two-way exchange, win-win cooperation. So China positioning in itself as an ethical alternative to unequal, usually European or Western forms of engagement with the global South. So obviously that construction implies that African students are part of an equal exchange. But on kind of, particularly on the Forum on Africa, on China-Africa Cooperation website, there's a second kind of discourse that constructs African students, by extension their governments, as grateful recipients of help and assistance from a relatively advanced China. So very unequal. So China just in these kind of policy texts, China describes itself as a ray of hope and describes African countries as lagging behind China. So two very contradictory messages that kind of reflect China's self-positioning as a counter-hegemon to the global north, and also its kind of real positioning as a hegemon to increasingly large swathes of the global south. So I'm just going to run through the key takeaways from the empirical chapters. So first of all, the pre-mobility lives of this group of students that took part in this study. So, and then these students kind of from a really, really wide range of backgrounds. And a lot of them are, not what we would typically expect an international student to be. So in the international student mobility literature, until recently, there's been kind of this assumption that international student mobility is to preserve the global middle class. Increasingly, that's being challenged, including by this study. So because of the availability of scholarships, and this is kind of complicated because some of the scholarships, there seems to be some nepotism and they seem to directly go to the children of business or political elites, but some of the scholarships do go to people from highly disadvantaged backgrounds within the context of their home country. And for them, that might represent the only opportunity to access higher education, never mind international higher education. And I think that's related to the mechanisms through which the scholarships are administered. So some of them are administered through the Chinese embassy. Some of them are administered, they're kind of given to the local Ministry of Education to administer. And I think the embassy mechanism is generally associated with being slightly less transparent and less competitive and more to do with kind of connections. And That's among the students that I interviewed. So there's two students in particular that I talk about in this chapter that were kind of, one of them was orphaned and one of them was sent away from his family at a young age. So they were kind of academic high achievers from really, really disadvantaged backgrounds. So really non-typical, and I kind of follow that story through the book. And then members of the middle class, but I really don't think they're very similar to, if we think about middle class students from East Asia that have been the focus of probably the bulk of international student mobility research. So I describe them as non-global members of the middle classes. So they're not part of a kind of globally orientated, very internationally mobile middle class, but kind of a precarious, very new in most cases middle class. So historically in Africa, there's not been a strong middle class. There's been kind of elites and everybody else, a kind of a tiny elite group. And the middle class is kind of emergent in most countries. And in often cases, these students were kind of precarious members of the middle class. And they felt very kind of insecure in their middle classness. And then at the same time, there was people who were the sons and daughters of political and business elites. So yeah, I spoke to a couple of students that basically their parents had gone to the embassy and the embassy had said, "Oh, would you like a scholarship to go to study in China?" It's as simple as that. So there was kind of quite a widespread perception of nepotism or like corruption in the scholarship process, and that led to these elites being able to receive them. Then there were some really interesting cases of students that were sent by their home country government. So two students from Eritrea, they weren't kind of sent willingly. So that kind of confounds everything we know about international student mobility. They completely had no choice. They were just sent to China because the scholarships were offered and the government said you have to go. So I kind of reflect on what that means and what the implications of that are as well. And I also mention, although they weren't in my sample, because of I sampled students from several cities across China and not from the trade hubs, but other research. So Heidi Haugen's research and Elaine Ho's research on this focus on students who are actually wanting to do business and they just want a visa, and becoming a student offers the best means to get a kind of a visa for the longest amount of time. So yeah, in the chapter after that, the discussion is around how do these students actually end up in China? So the decision-making processes that lead them to enroll in Chinese universities. One of the chapter headings is disadvantaged students. It's always difficult for us to realistically think we can go and study abroad. So these students benefited from the scholarships, which provide, well, at the time of the interviews, at least, they provided 3,000 yuan a month for master's students, 3,500 for doctoral students. So that's quite like not a lot to live on in most Chinese cities, but it's enough. And for those students, language learning was the pathway to study in China as well. And there's 60-something Confucius Institutes across Africa now, and those tend to play a really important role in making people aware that they can study in China. So lots of students, they kind of learn Chinese at the Confucius Institute because it was the only free option to learn another language, and then they became aware that, oh, I can go study in China and I can get the scholarship. And that's kind of how that worked. Yeah, then so I mentioned the case of the Eritrean students. So it's not an option. For them, it wasn't a choice. So, when we think about migration, we usually think about choice. There's, the concept of forced migration, but that's usually related to natural disasters and things like that. So I call this kind of involuntary mobility to differentiate it from that. So they're kind of compelled by their governments to take up a scholarship offered by the Chinese government because Eritrea is an ally of China. They kind of appreciated the opportunity to study overseas because otherwise, they were in kind of lifetime national service, kind of press ganged into that, and so this was an opportunity for them to kind of develop themselves on leave that they wouldn't otherwise have had. But at the same time, they feared the consequences of disobeying their government. Yeah, and usually for middle class students, they're leveraging this power asymmetry. So they thought that the particular relationship between China and their home country, the level of trade and the rarity kind of value of Chinese would made China a kind of rational choice among the destinations that they could have chosen. Usually they weren't able to study in Europe due to visa rejections, lots of hoops to jump through, deposits, language tests, which are quite expensive, that otherwise that China just doesn't have. So this was just the best option for them, the best kind of quality of education that they could have got, and also it's kind of a strategic a way of benefiting from the relationship between China and their home country. The social elites obviously taking advantage of Chinese public diplomacy efforts, as I've mentioned. So in terms of students' experiences in China, the interviews, and this has also been the case in other studies as well. So if you look at the work of, there's a book by, I think it's Sarah Gillespie. It's also Kenneth King's book, and Shan Lan as well on Africans in China. Usually race is really central to students' experiences. So in this chapter, the focus is on race in China, and the uniqueness of China when it comes to race and racialization and racism. So I discussed kind of the rise of social Darwinism obviously with influence from the West, in China in the early 20th century, and how that rise led to kind of a hierarchization that was never really addressed. So really important quote from the book Race, The History of Race in China by Cheng Ying Hong. So what happened to racism, especially since the founding of the People's Republic, was political denunciation as part of an anti-Western ideological campaign rather than a academic, cultural, historical, or psychological examination or self-reflection. So very little awareness of racism in China, but that was really central to this chapter. And looking at that, China, the idiosyncrasies of China's kind of cultural and political system, and its history of immigration, or lack of, and how that shapes the experiences of migrants in the country. And that's kind of contributing to a broader goal of the book, which is to enable an exploration of how multiple kind of layered modernity, so transnational modernity, and also a specific Chinese or kind of idiosyncratic Chinese modernity shape the experiences of these students. So yeah, first of all, the siloing of what I refer to as the siloing of students into two academic streams. So kind of like an informal kind of segregation of international and local students. And generally, students didn't have a great impression of the teaching quality, and felt that teachers were more serious about teaching Chinese students. And so generally they found that to be disadvantageous. And at the same time, there was this social kind of siloing as well. So it was really difficult for students. There was a few students that did develop kind of really good close relationships with local students, but often that ended in frustration. But usually these students kind of went in with the best intentions, level of curiosity, and also they thought that if I can kind of become more integrated, then that would be beneficial as a learning experience for my career and things like that. But it just didn't work out. And generally outside of off the campus as well, there was experiences of racialization and discrimination. Students' accounts were really central. And that again reflects a lot of the other research that's been undertaken on this topic. And the final empirical chapter highlights the way that students navigate these global and kind of local as well regimes of mobility. So I highlight three kind of broad trajectories that students might go on, while also stressing that there's kind of some slight differences within these three broad categorizations. And here I draw on the concept of global regimes of mobility, and how students navigate those global structures of capitalism, racialization, and these global policy kind of networks. So mobility regimes essentially intersecting systems that differentially and importantly inequitably allow or prevent mobility or migration across different social groups. And they include state migration apparatus as well as local practices. So the concept serves to emphasize how policies and practices tend to make mobility more possible for some than others. So these students were kind of differentially affected by these regimes of mobility. So the biggest group was students that planned to already had returned home. Several different reasons why they might want to do that. So the big one obviously is just the difficulty of getting a post-work visa, experiences of discrimination in China, and also perceptions that they would be discriminated against in the labor market. Also obligations at home. So some of the students had family back home. They couldn't bring them to China. So they just had no choice to go back. Some of them expressed kind of a sense of duty to contribute to development in their home countries. And I thought that kind of complicated, often we think about student, or one of the theoretical frames that's often used is Bourdieu's capitals. So we often think of it as kind of a rational, a means of getting kind of accumulating capital for benefit in the labor market at home. But really a lot of the students' decisions to return home had nothing to do with accumulating capitals. It was just a sense that they wanted to contribute to changing and improving things in their home countries. So that was really common. There were students that lived near major kind of import-export markets, and they had plans to export kind of medical equipment, agricultural equipment, things like that. So really interesting ways that students are contributing to development through their study in their home country, through their study in China. And then obviously they also perceived that their skills would be devalued in China, so they'd be kind of stigmatized because of where they come from. But they felt that the skills that they developed in China, particularly the ability to speak Chinese, would be really highly valued in their home countries. Then there's these relatively kind of privileged students usually that had enough kind of money to start up a business. Usually they didn't. So in other studies, they focused on students that came with the intention of trading, but these students usually developed businesses just because they saw an opportunity to do so. They didn't come with that plan. and because they wanted to stay in China, but this was the only means of them doing so. And this wasn't just to do with import and export, as we often think about African migrants in China associated with importing and exporting, but also to do with education consulting, for example. And then those who wanted to study elsewhere. And I'll just wrap up now. So yeah, I mean, one contribution of the book, or maybe the major contribution, is the account of these practice stories. So the kind of trajectories of these students from a wider range of backgrounds. Them have typically been focused on in studies of international student mobility, and one of the focuses that is strong throughout the book is on the heterogeneity of those captured in the selection criteria. So just a much wider range of students than you would probably think. Then I also wanted to reflect briefly on the future of Africa-China student mobility. So obviously, one kind of thing is the lowered scholarship commitments. What will that mean? I think that is really it's uncertain at the moment. It's hard to say, but I think ultimately, and then there's also the issue of racism, and particularly during COVID, that I think some students were shocked about. So will that have an impact down the line? I actually doubt it, just because we've seen in other places like Australia, the UK, similar problems, but that doesn't really seem to have a huge impact on student numbers. Then also, I felt that the students, so the focus of the study wasn't on soft power, but I definitely got a sense that these students didn't wholly have a positive image of China. And that's obviously when we see discussions by policymakers around soft power through international education, there's this assumption that the students will just they'll come here and they'll realize how great it is, and then they'll tell everybody at home. But it's not that simple. And definitely the students in this study, they were really ambivalent about their experiences in China. So I think it serves to kind of complicate that as well. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to answering any questions that you have.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you so much, Ben, for summarizing a big book with lots in it in a very short time. We have a bit more than 20 minutes for questions. And as you know, I've done some work in this area as well. And of course, Amelia, I wanted to ask you a bit about different types of students, and particularly how you might differentiate the experiences according to their career positions. But actually, other people in the chat have already raised those questions. So I'm going to go straight to Monty King. Monty, do you want to ask your question, please?
Yeah, thanks. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for the kind of summary of the book. I had a chance to read the first chapter. I think it was available for free on Google Books. I was looking at the story of those first African scholarship students, and it resonated with me just because I did ethnographic research into scholarship students in Timor-Leste, and I was really surprised by the number of people who reported some pretty horrific experiences in various countries, including Australia and the UK. Not just racism, but also just a very brief story. A student who got into a master's program requiring an 8 out of 9 in IELTS. She was given 6 months of English language training, got 7.5 in her IELTS, and was promptly sent home. Really, that kind of experience is not an outlier always. So this idea, I always think of like the Willy Wonka golden ticket, that it's this ticket to prosperity, to mobility, but it can, it does, have a double edge to it. You kind of touched on some of this, but the question I wanted to ask first was around what you see in terms of returnees doing things like being involved. I found a lot of Timorese scholarship students returning to public service. So basically, it was almost a reproduction of colonial era for Timor-Leste. It's Portugal. So you had any Timorese students in the 50s, 60s, 1970s who went to Portugal usually ended up coming back and becoming functionaries, becoming public servants. And you see a lot of that in Timor-Leste now. I was wondering whether you saw much evidence of the African students going back to, say, for example, work on Belt and Road projects, given their kind of knowledge of Chinese and Chinese culture. So many more questions for you, but that probably is enough.
Great, thanks, Monty.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. I mean, thanks for that. It's a really good question. And it's something that I really want to know about it as well. And that's kind of my plan for a follow-up project. I would say that among the students that I interviewed that did return, it was really common to go into work that was somehow China related in some form or another. But whether that is really helping in any big way to meeting China's foreign policy goals is another question. So a really common one was to go back and work in translation. That was a goal of a lot of the students. So obviously those students aren't really having a massive influence on policy or changing things in the long term. That's really unlikely. But in some small way, they're kind of facilitating, particularly like small and medium-sized enterprises, Chinese enterprises in their home country to do business. So you can say that in some small way they are contributing to those goals. Then in terms of students that had been back longer, so in another study that I've done, I think particularly with those earlier graduates, when there was fewer of them, I get the sense that their impact is likely to be greater because people at that stage in their career that have had that experience in China are quite unusual. So I met people that were in politics. Somebody that was working for the Ugandan kind of authority for the I'm not exactly sure of the name of it, but they kind of hand out the contracts for oil and gas extraction. And then also there was, you mentioned the Belt and Road as well. There's quite a few students that did engineering in China. So I did an engineering undergraduate degree that went on to work on Chinese infrastructure projects. That was a really common one. And they also said that, yeah, once, the hiring manager kind of knew that I'd spent time in China, could speak a little bit of Chinese, they just immediately said, yes, you're on board. And so there's a lot of students involved. Now there's another student working for, I think it was a Chinese aircraft manufacturing company, and he was this sales representative in Rwanda. So lots of little things like that. But it's a question of, I think in the longer term, will the students have the inclination if they do get into a position? So first of all, would they get into a position where they would actually be able to influence policy at all? That seems possible. But then would they have the inclination to actually do things that are or make decisions or influence decisions in the interest of China? That's another question. So it's really complex. But I think that's a really important direction for future research, is to see how these students maintain ties with China, and how they're involved with kind of Chinese enterprises, or how they're involved with local politics, and exactly what their involvement is, and are they actually influencing policy in the interests of China, or are they kind of more critical? Yeah. So I hope that kind of broadly answers you.
That's great. I mean, I think let's come back to this question of deliberate soft power cultivation, but let's go first to the more sort of substantive questions. Rachel, you had some really interesting questions about the types of institution they're staying at.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Ben. Thanks very much for your presentation. I was just wondering, I mean, the kind of heterogeneity that you talk about, I was just wondering whether, as a consequence of that, you're seeing greater sort of stratification of international student mobility opportunities in China. Because I guess when we look at places like kind of India and China, where various researchers have shown this kind of, increased participation of people from like lower middle class backgrounds or even working class backgrounds, a number of those have argued that the opportunities that they take up in the destination country are not all equal, either differences in status of the universities they're attending or differences in status of the courses that they're following. So I just wonder whether you found similar kind of things in your study, or actually were the opportunities broadly similar?
Great.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question as well. So thank you for that. I mean, in terms of evidence of stratification, I mean, what I can give you is kind of a small scale and kind of anecdotal, and yeah, so in terms of evidence, that I'm not aware of any studies that have actually looked into that. I mean, it seems likely. I would say that particularly, I think there's a stratification in terms of the cities that students study in as well. There was kind of a perception that particularly Shanghai, Beijing, where a lot of the elite universities are, the students that were on scholarships from disadvantaged backgrounds weren't really thinking about those places, just because they wouldn't really be able to live on the scholarship stipend in those places. So that's kind of one potential means of stratification. But I would say that it seems likely, but it's difficult for me to say. And in my sample, I didn't really notice that strongly. I think just because the number of students that I spoke to.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. I mean, I can see the challenge here also is that that even if you haven't got a scholarship, even if you are self-funding, the sort of the economics of it are still difficult if you're coming from even a middle-class African background. But Maya, please come in.
Hello, Ben. Thank you so much for your presentation. Just a quick clarification question and then the main question. Did these individuals, your participants, try to study abroad elsewhere? So did you have participants who tried, attempted, or maybe even had the options to study anywhere? So my main question is about the literature on this topic from the academics based at universities in Africa across different countries. So what kind of literature is that? I do not know much of that literature. I'm genuinely interested if such literature is produced, and what are the key interests of academics in Africa in this topic, in the mobility from Africa to China, student mobility as well as academic mobility or any sorts of mobilities. Thank you.
So, I mean, the first question, so for some of the students, I think they had considered going elsewhere. A lot of them mentioned Europe, obviously because it's closer, and often there's ties from the colonial period for students from like Francophone and Anglophone countries, in particular in my study. Yeah, so in quite a few cases, for the middle class students, they had thought about studying in Europe, but financially, usually scholarships are part of it, although actually despite the fact that the availability of scholarships is much greater in China than in most other destinations, still like only a minority of students actually receive them. So most of the middle class students, or many of the middle class students, were self-financing anyway, but it's just the cost of living is lower. There's fewer hoops to jump through as well, so it's just a simpler option and less chance of your visa being rejected or something like that. Because lots of countries within Africa have really high visa refusal rate, for example, in the UK. And also it's just far cheaper. And these aren't necessarily, so a lot of them said that we had students in our school that would go to the UK, but we always felt that they were very different from us anyway. We always knew they were from a different social background. So most of these students aren't elites that can afford, £25,000 a year or however much to go study in the UK or, the US, somewhere like that. Many of them planned to move on to a third country. so say, like about a quarter of them. Sometimes a different country within Africa, but in most cases Europe for further study. So they felt that their experiences in China in kind of a higher ranking university would enable them to apply for scholarships in the West, and so they benefit in that way. Yeah, and then so in your question in the chat, you've also asked, were the participants they were mostly master's students, and that's just slightly more common, just because it's a shorter time. Usually they've done their undergraduate in their home country and then they move to China, or yeah, that's the case in most cases. Then, I mean, that is a really interesting question on this particular topic, and David might be able to correct me, but I really don't think there has been much at all written by scholars working in African universities. I mean, there's a couple of things by scholars originally from Africa working elsewhere, which are kind of just general overviews of student mobility, usually not empirical, like not drawing on primary data. And I think there's a couple of articles as well focused on the soft power kind of elements, and just kind of speculating about how this might be contributing to soft power, China's soft power in Africa. But I think it's interesting that not a lot has been written on this. But at the same time, and again, David probably knows more about this than me, but there's lots of doctoral researchers returning from China to their home countries, working in research institutes, universities. I've come across a couple of books written by those scholars on, I think the books that I've seen are on international relations. So one of them was a history of the international relations between this scholar's home country and China, and the Chinese embassy helped to publish that, presumably because it's quite positive in its tone. So I mean, that's what I found, and I think it's an interesting point that actually not much has been written on this from an African perspective.
Yeah, I think that's right, Ben. And I think it's interesting. The question is perhaps the scholars who are working on other things other than higher education. I'm aware we've still got lots of questions, so I'm going to ask actually a couple of questions at a time now. Anna, do you want to ask your question, and then Natasha as well, and then perhaps Ben, you can answer both of them. Anna.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, my question was about the role of the Confucius Institutes in the journey, the mobility journey of African students. And I think probably considering if there's any correlation between where Confucius Institutes are located and Belt and Road projects. I mean, we've noticed that since the move away from Hanban, it seems quite hard to find accurate information about Confucius Institutes overseas now. So I just wanted your reflections on that. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Anna. And then perhaps links into Natasha's comment as well about the difficulty of finding statistics. Natasha, do you want to come in?
Yeah, very relevant. My question was about why do you think that there's been a reduction in statistics collection about African students in China post-COVID? Is that what are the politics of that kind of data collection, or do you think it's more of a logistical question? Thanks.
Great. Two ones for you there, Ben.
I might answer the Natasha's question first, just because I think the answer is a bit more brief. I don't know, and I think it's really interesting, but it's not just about African students. And again, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's been any statistics released on incoming students to China since 2019. And I think originally that was related to the pandemic, because there weren't any students coming in, actually physically coming into the country. So they just stopped releasing that data. And my feeling is, I'd be interested to hear what you think as well. But for me, you mentioned that there could be maybe a political rationale for doing that. And I'm not sure. My instinct was that it was just a logistical thing, that they stopped doing it. And then nobody asked them to start doing it again, so they didn't. Because it's obviously just one office within the a Ministry of Education. But you never know. And I don't know, do you have any other thoughts about that, Natasha? Sorry to ask you a question.
No, I mean it's very speculative. I was wondering whether if I think my hunch is that student mobility in China has reduced drastically. Maybe also the COVID pandemic and China's response to it had a big maybe negative impact on China's global standing and the attractiveness of China as a culture to become familiar with, perhaps. And maybe is it embarrassing if to China if there's been such a reduction in students who want to come to China? I guess also China's economy has changed. There's now almost 25% youth unemployment in China. So so maybe the idea of bringing in more youth into China feels politically untenable at the moment. I don't know. These are all just
I mean, so that's I think all of those things could be true, but it's just impossible to say. I think the point about it being controversial is really interesting because I've seen every time international students seem to come up in the news in China, it always seems to be, why are we paying for them, and why do they get better living conditions than local students? Why do they get all these scholarships and we don't? So there's a lot of kind of resentment. So that's very possible, particularly in the current economic climate. That actually sounds like a reasonable explanation. And to move on to the other question, it's also interesting. So the statistics, I don't know where these came from, but they're in a Chinese government source that I read. Is the Blue Book on student studying abroad and China. It mostly talks about outbound mobility, but it also talks about the fact that the number of students coming from the US, pre-pandemic it was something like 13,000, and then last year it was 350. So massive reduction. And could that be the case across the board? There's obviously reasons to believe that for the US, the reduction would be much more drastic than other locations, but we don't know. So moving on to the second question. So there's where in the rest of the world, or not in the rest of the world really, in the West, there's the number of Confucius Institutes is declining. It's increasing in Africa. There's not the same kind of controversy surrounding them. And they're much more important as a source of funding for universities, usually relatively poorly resourced universities in Africa. So I mentioned in the presentation there's 60 something. And it's interesting that they play a much larger role within, or tend to play a much larger role in African universities than in the UK, for example. So at the University of Glasgow, it's just a small centre with 4 or 5 employees. But for example, in Kenya, there's like an agricultural research centre. They have like a model agricultural village, and that's a huge part of what they offer in Kenya. So the remit of Confucius Institutes is much broader, and I can't say much about correlations, obviously, between whether the number of Confucius Institutes and the Belt and Road or anything like that. But in terms of my study, what I found is several of the students that I spoke to, they had been learning Chinese. So they'd usually gone to the kind of flagship universities in their country, whether that's Tanzania or Uganda or wherever else. And they, invariably always have a Confucius Institute. That's usually the only opportunity that they would have to kind of learn an extra language in their spare time completely for free. So that's how they get interested in it. And then the Confucius Institute makes them aware of the opportunity to study in China. Most of them wouldn't have had the opportunity to study outside of their home country otherwise. So they just think this is an opportunity for me to go outside the country that I never would have had. So that's, that's kind of the pathway, how it happens. It seems pretty common. How common it is for all students, I can't say, but I think it's really interesting how that works. And obviously students really value the opportunity to learn Chinese. And I think it is really important for them when they return to their home country. It's what makes them stand out in the labor market. A lot of them got translation work. And obviously, fluency in Chinese is a really rare skill in most places, and particularly in places like Tanzania, Uganda, other countries in Africa. So,
Thank you. Thanks.
Brilliant. Yes, very thoughtful and really interesting answers, Ben. I mean, it's great you're sort of acknowledging we don't know all the answers, and that's really important to enjoy that and be honest about it. We're going to come to the end now, but there's one final question that comes back to this question of soft power. Hyunji Kim, do you want to come in on this question as the last one, thinking about the implications of these student experiences in relationship to soft power?
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Ben. I'm actually doing a PhD about sub-Saharan student mobility to South Korea, and I particularly enjoyed like comparing the difference and like similarities between two mobility dynamics. So in my research, when I asked African students in Korea to rank their potential study destinations according to their preference, like in the most cases, China was often ranked even below their own country. So the most common reason cited for them was like the racist experience of their peers who are currently studying in China or who study already in China. So I wonder, like, if you think the Chinese government is aware of, or they really concerned about the potential like backlash or reverse impact of its soft power due to their negative experience as discrimination, and how is China like addressing that issue, or does it consider the scholarship like less efficient? Yes, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. Yeah, what you just said is really interesting, because I was speaking to somebody last week, and they asked me, whether the racism that students experience in China, that would have a knock-on effect for future recruitment. And I said probably not, because I thought that given the fact that, for example, in a year you might get, if we take Ghana as an example, you might get 6,000 students from Ghana going to China. That's not that many. So I thought that wouldn't necessarily be well covered in media in Ghana. So there might be a low level of awareness of those kinds of issues in students' home countries. So it's interesting that your study suggests that actually there is some level of awareness, and that's actually putting students off. And I think it's important to note that I think that the kind of experiences that students have in China, racism exists everywhere, but I think there's particularities to the experience in China that might make it more off-putting, just the fact how homogenous China is and the lack of a history of immigration, things like that. In terms of what the government is doing to address it, I don't think that it's really possible for them to do much, because it's kind of, I mean, we spoke earlier about the controversy surrounding international students anyway, and the perception that they're getting preferential treatment. And I think the government's more aware of that discourse than the idea that the students are being treated in a discriminatory manner. And also the experiences that these students have is closely tied in with ethnic nationalism in China, which is on the rise, and it's intentionally kind of stoked by the government anyway. So I doubt they would do anything to undermine that. But at the same time, I think it's important to note that at the university level, I think lots of administrators are aware that students face these kinds of issues, and as they become, because lots of universities don't have, especially not the less prestigious universities in China, they don't have a long history of dealing with international students, and they're slowly kind of improving in terms of how that, I think they try and, generally from what I heard, they try and treat students well, and they're kind of considerate, and those issues are becoming less common within the university in terms of the administration. I think it's more difficult between teachers and students, and and when students go off campus as well, I doubt much will change. And I personally, I haven't seen any signs of that changing or the government doing anything to address it.
Good. I mean, drawing on our research that, I mean, disclosure here, I mean, Natasha and I have done some research with doctoral students. I think you're right that it's not necessarily a buyer's market. I mean, you might hope to get a scholarship to go and study in Europe, but if you don't, then China is a great one to get to, and so you haven't necessarily got lots of choice, and you might be aware of some of the ambivalent experiences, but actually, if it gives you a scholarship for a degree, or it's a part of your job that you need to upgrade your qualifications, and therefore the government has required you, then you take it, I guess. And I think you're absolutely right that universities are creating environments that are, try and be supportive. And we heard quite a lot about particular universities that had large groups of students, where students were getting organized and setting up African student unions, a bit like Emmanuel Hevy did in the 60s. As a way of not necessarily sort of to cause trouble, but more to sort of just provide some support networks,
a bit of solidarity.
Solidarity. And so I think that's really interesting, that the large communities of students from certain countries in certain universities, and those are definitely, as you say, second-tier universities. They're not necessarily the elites. Ben, you've given us a really, really great taste of your book. I hope you've inspired everyone to go and read it, and we look forward to whatever comes next in terms of thinking about how these research experiences, student experiences translate. And when you think about sort of imperial soft power, it's amazing how many students from Africa came to Britain and immediately got involved in anti-colonial organizing as a result of being here in the UK. But that doesn't necessarily mean that soft power was was ruined. It was, well, it was the end of power, which is like a different thing altogether. But Ben, great. Thank you all very much for coming. Really enjoyed it. And do all come back next week for our next webinar. See you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for listening. Bye-bye.